welcome everybody here tonight. I'm really honored to have you spend the next hour with me. I have a lot of material to cover, but my goal for you is to get an understanding of fluoride, how it works, and let's go through the science because this is a really hot topic right at the moment, as you all well appreciate. And I really want you to be able to make your own opinion based on your level of the science as we go through this. And as you read through the science, form your own opinion. And also at the same time, be able to meet your patients where they are and be able to discuss it with them for those patients who are in favor of fluoride, that you can assure them, the science support that supports that. And for the ones that are, fluoride averse, you can also respect their opinion and but maybe help share with them some of the science so maybe they have a better understanding about it. So let's get started. We got a lot to go through tonight. I was in private practice in Albany, Oregon for 42 years. I'm currently CEO of Oral Biotech. I've written a couple of books on dental caries, balance, and also why me. And I have a podcast, a dental podcast, Contrary to Ordinary. So tonight's topics are really about fluoride, the benefits and the risks. So I really think when we look at anything, we need to look at what's the benefit and what's the risk. And we'll do the same thing with nano-HA. One thing I want you to know right out of the gate, fluoride is not a remineralizing agent. Like we think of it that way, we use it for the purpose of remineralization, but it's really not a remineralizing agent. It's the FDA considers it an anti-caries agent. And if we look at the role of fluoride in remineralization, it does play a role, but you can't have remineralization with just fluoride. You have to have calcium and phosphate ions or calcium and phosphate in the form of a hydroxyapatite, a nanocrystallite. You have to have calcium phosphate present to remineralize the teeth. Fluoride does not remineralize teeth. Fluoride is the strongest negative charged ion in the entire periodic chart. So it's highly reactive. It has a strong attraction to calcium ions, which, by the way, are very strongly positively charged. Fluoride, we know it reduces the microbial acid production potentiated also by xylitol. It enhances remineralization. It accelerates remineralization. It also increases the degree of crystallinity in the enamel during remineralization, and it makes the enamel more resistant to demineralization. So it's kind of an anti-demineralizing agent. Once you have fluorapatite, the pH, the critical pH drops to 4.5 and the enamel becomes more acid resistant. And I think we all understand that. Um, Remineralization occurs from the outside of the tooth in. It doesn't start on the inside and go out. It starts on the outside. So the outside of the enamel in an initial lesion starts to remineralize first. And when it gets to a point of about 200, 250 microns deep, so that's like a quarter of a millimeter deep into the enamel, remineralization pretty much stops there because now the surface is closed, and so you can't really get a lot of remineralization below that surface. Now, that does occur slowly as crystallites shift internally in that lesion, but that is months and years in the process. So when we think about remineralization, we really just consider that we're really remineralizing, the top quarter millimeter of that initial lesion. So when we look at it, you kind of get this superficial layer of remineralized enamel, and it kind of seals off the lower lesion, underlying lesion, and so you don't really get a lot of remineralization below there. Doesn't matter because once you get that remineralized surface, it's actually more resistant to decay, new decay, than the healthy enamel that's right next to it. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that when you look at surface microhardness tests, after you've remineralized a lesion, you never get it back to 100%. But it is more resistant to demineralization. Um, so this is what those crystallites look like. This is what enamel looks like when you get into a 250,000 magnification SEM on one of these lesions. Those little kind of Lego blocks are about 20 to 40 nanometers in length. They're kind of rod shaped and they're pretty regular in size. And these form together and form enamel rods which weave and then create the entire enamel matrix. Um, We'll get into that. That's a very important concept, the size, when we get into talking about nano HA. But I just want you to get a feel for this is what demineralized enamel or that initial lesion starts to look like, and size is really important on that. Now, when we talk about fluoride and we look at the benefits are well established. I'm not going to go through all the science on this because we could spend weeks going through this because there is so much. It reduces the DMFT scores in children and adolescents. It makes the enamel more resistant to acid demineralization, which I just mentioned. It does reduce the acid production in the oral biofilm as well. And it's been considered one of the most important global health interventions in the 20th century. So, fluoride, the benefits are, I mean, we all understand those. Fluoride Ground Zero was in 1945 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This was during World War II, and they began studying fluoride first on soldiers because you had a cohort of all these young people together that were easy to study. Then they started studying the effect of fluoride on dental students, and then we got some of our earliest fluoride in oral healthcare products in the 1950s. But the first water fluoridation started in 1945. Currently, we have about 74 million Americans who are not on fluoridated community water systems. So, this is kind of a breakdown of, by the states, as we look at that. And this is one of the challenges we've got. This was from the Cochrane database, and if you're not familiar with the Cochrane database, this is a body that does systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and they are the most unbiased, purest level of analysis of our science on the planet. It's the most revered and highly respected um, reviews. So when we talk about the Cochrane, you get a Cochrane report, you can pretty much depend on it. That's the best science we have available. And one of the challenges we've got is most of the studies that were done on fluoridated water and dental caries were done prior to 1975. So most of the available scientific evidence is old. So that's older than what? 50, it's 50 years old or more. And since 1975, we've got the development of all of these oral healthcare products that have fluoride. Fluoride is in everything when you look at, its availability. And so we tend to think of, well, maybe it's not as relevant today because now we got all these other sources of fluoride. And the question is it still relevant? And the one thing that I would throw in, a caveat I would throw into this equation is our diet and our pharmaceutical use has changed dramatically since 1975. And those are two really big risks for dental caries as well. So while maybe we've got alternate sources of fluoride, our risk for decay has increased based on our diet and use of prescription medications in the United States. So I would say that has changed since 1975. But still today, the CDC identifies that about community water fluoridation reduces DMFT scores in primary teeth by about 30% per year, and in permanent teeth, about 12%. So it still has an impact on DMFT scores, particularly in kids. So we know that it still has some impact. And one of the questions is, well, if we take the fluoride out of the water, what's going to happen to the lower socioeconomic group in our country that have limited access to care? By removing the fluoride out of the water, is this going to put them at a disadvantage? And here's a Cochrane report. Again, this is from 2024, and they identify that while it does appear to reduce the MFT scores in children and adolescents, there's insufficient evidence to determine whether we take it out of the water, whether that will have any change in the disparities in caries according to socioeconomic status. So there just isn't data. So to make that decision, recommend one way or another. So we just need to be kind of honest about that. This is a study that came out of Pennsylvania and it was published last year. They took a survey in their health survey from the state of Pennsylvania. They took 4,120 third graders and they looked at their DMFT scores and whether or not they were, on community fluoridated water, and also looked at their dietary habits. And it was fluoride in the water was significantly associated with a reduced DMFT score in these kids, which comes as no surprise. Now, one of the things that's been tossed around is that fluoride, fluoridated water, exposure to fluoride reduces the IQ and development of children in their brain, neuronal development. And we're going to go through a study that talks about that. This study that found that, and they looked at individuals from the age 16 to 26, and those who were exposed and those who were not exposed to community water fluoridation, and found there was no difference. So there was no impact of the fluoride in terms of IQ scores on those individuals. Now, we also know that um, we have studies that demonstrate that fluoride interferes with some thyroid hormones. And this comes from the Canadian Health Measure Survey. And this was from 2017, but on a population level, looking at the population in Canada, water fluoridation, fluoride, did not impact um, thyroid hormones. So it's like on a population level, didn't seem to have an impact. On an individual level, that may be completely, entirely different. This I thought was a very interesting study that came out years ago from Finland, and they actually looked at there was a benefit to fluoride, it appeared, at reducing coronary heart disease. And the benefit there they proposed was that it reduced oral infections, and that in turn reduced mortality. And it was not causal, but it was strongly associated between areas of when they looked at areas of fluoridated water in Finland and then the coronary heart disease. They were pretty closely related. So I thought that was just very interesting. So there may be a positive benefit in your systemic health from being exposed to fluoride. Um, we all are aware of the fact, I hope, that Utah in March became the first state in the United States to ban fluoride from all public water systems. On May 15th, Florida became state number two, and that goes into effect on July 1st of 2025. There's a bunch of happy cowboys there in that photo, and there's maybe one or two cowboys that don't look happy. And I actually am a cowboy. I have that cowboy hat, so it's interesting. But that's happened. Now, on the flip side of that, Calgary in Canada removed the fluoride from their water system in 2011, and they are putting it back. So I find that interesting. This has been studied a lot, and in Calgary, as soon as they took the water out of the system, the decay rate in children virtually doubled. And so, that was an issue. Now, they didn't take it out of the water in 2011 because of any political or health decision. They literally, the city council was faced with a $20 million bill to implement a new system. Their system was antiquated and needed to be replaced, and they decided not to spend the 20. It was a financial decision. They didn't want to spend the $20 million. Well, this year they're putting it back. So I think that's quite a statement in terms of looking at populations and the outcome or the impact that fluoride in the water has on community health. Now let's talk about the case against fluoride, because there are a lot of studies that show some potential systemic effects and health risks from being exposed to fluoride. And, as head now of HHS, we've got Robert Kennedy Jr., who is promoting removing fluoride from all the community water sources. Um, and you can't ignore these studies, right? And I want to go through those with you so you kind of get a feel for them and kind of have an understanding of like, well, what's behind that? And let's take a balanced look at those studies and what does that really mean? The number one side effect from fluoride at elevated levels is fluorosis of the teeth. And I know you've probably seen that in your practices, but that's the number one most common side effect, and that's well established that fluorosis occurs from an overexposure of fluoride. We talked about the thyroid hormone interference. We talked about the developmental neuron function and development, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we look at those studies. And they believe the mechanism is from the adenosine monophosphate kinase. So if you guys remember the Krebs cycle, the ATP, AMP, they believe that the fluoride interferes with that cycle, and then it creates oxidative stress within the cells, and the cells don't develop. And so that's the theory on why we get this damage. Um, this is Maria Sokolina. She's an amazing dentist in New York City, And she's also a journalist and writes for Forbes magazine. This came out earlier this year. Um, and her point is the thought of having fluoride in the water is kind of like a forced medication, and it eliminates individual choice, liking it to mass medication. And I think we're a lot more sensitive now in the United States based on COVID. I think your patients, and certainly I feel that way, I start to question things that the government is demanding that I do for my health, rather than, I'd like to have my choice over my own body and my own health, right? And so I think this has kind of played a role in this, that people feel some sentiment about, I resent being forced to take a medication. And, of course, you can argue that, well, you don't have to take it. You can filter your water, so you're not exposed to it. But, again, it's just, I think it's that whole concept that is driving some of this from a political standpoint. So we talked about fluorosis. You know, we see fluorosis with dental caries, or I mean, sorry, with fluoride exposure, and that's that occurs at a level of about 1.5 parts per million. We start to see fluorosis, and so there's a band of naturally existing fluoride in the water that's much higher than that, come kind of through Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, and you see patients that come from there that have natural fluorosis in their teeth. Now, one of the things when you look at these studies that I think we all need to be aware of, particularly the animal studies, you'll read an animal study and it'll say, oh, the fluoride did this or it did that. It had this systemic toxic effect. And a lot of these studies, when you look at them, they're using fluoride levels of 100 parts per million to even 200 parts per million. So, I mean, stop and think about this. We're recommending zero point 0 or zero point 0.7 parts per million in fluoridated water. This is a couple of hundred times, 250 times that. If we all need sodium chloride, table salt. We all need sodium chloride in our body to survive. Uh, but if you took 250 times a daily recommended dose, it's toxic. You die from salt poisoning. So it's like it has toxic effects. If you drank that much water, you would die. So it's like at some level, you have to be real about, okay, well, but we're not exposing people to that level. And so what impact or what risk is there genuinely? Now, this study came out and was published in 2018. This was case studies of 198 individuals. They had 213 controls, and they determined that a fluoride at a concentration of even less than zero point 0.5 milligrams per liter, which is zero point 0.5 parts per million. I think that's the language we're most familiar with, uh, did impact the TSH and also T3. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone comes from the pituitary gland, and it directs the production of T3 and T4 from the thyroid glands. And T3 and T4 are responsible for a lot of things in the body: your body temperature, your skin, your energy level, your metabolism, your hair. All of these different aspects to your body are influenced and controlled by that hormone. So with fluoride, even at less than a half a part per million, having an impact on those hormones, I think that should be a concern, and it should be a concern for anybody that certainly is hypothyroidism, right? So for somebody that has hypothyroidism, or maybe even a pregnant mom, um, that we should maybe recommend them drinking non-fluoridated water or filtering their water. I think that, and avoiding fluoridated healthcare products. So I think that makes sense. Um, there's the study on the neurotoxicity. I showed you the one at age 16 to 26, didn't seem to have any effect. This one indicated that it does increase, and it does uh, correlate as dose dependent, and it correlates all the way down to about 1.5 parts per million. And it does reduce neuronal development, and in this study, and or in this report, and it reduced the IQ by about 3 to 4 points, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but in actuality, that's pretty significant. So, there's a big difference between having an IQ of 96 and an IQ and being average at 100 in terms of your performance and success in high school and also later in college. So that is a consideration. But again, below 1.5 parts per million, there was no association whatsoever. Totally broke down. So at the levels that we're recommending, while it appears based on this study that it does have an impact, below 1.5 parts per million, it didn't have any impact. And so at zero point 0.7, which is in the fluoridated water, doesn't appear to be a concern. Although your patients are going to read this, it's going to be reported in the news media. People are going to take what they want out of it and create a story around that. I just want you to be aware that it is real, but below 1.5, it doesn't have an association. Now, this was a study that they combined three different cohorts and they looked at urinary fluoride, which is a very easy and pretty reliable way to measure fluoride exposure in the body. I'm going to talk about more about that in a little bit. Um, but it actually appeared to have an association as well. And again, it was dose dependent, but again, they recommended maybe children and pregnant women should be protected against fluoride toxicity. And this was on fluorosis, and at a level of 1.5 and below, that's when you don't see fluorosis in the teeth. So again, the levels that we're seeing, we used to be at 1.0 up until, I don't know, 10 years ago or so when the FDA came out and recommended that we drop it to 0.7, which would give us still the same benefit, but reduce our risk for fluorosis. And that was the primary concern. So um, we're trying to look on a health-based value for a daily intake, what's safe for an individual to take on a in a daily basis. But it appears that where we're at 0.7, if you have patients that are comfortable with fluoride or interested in fluoride, it appears to be safe. Um, and again, this was at 1.5 milligrams, or 1.5 parts per million of fluoride. Again, it was dose dependent. It was associated with a lowered IQ in children. And this was a systematic review in January of this year. But it's important to note that there were insufficient data to determine if the low level of fluoride of 0.7 parts per million currently recommended for the US has a negative effect on children's IQ because it stops at about 1 point. The data demonstrate there's no association below about 1.5. So again, that 1.5 seems to be kind of a magic number in the body in terms of both fluorosis and also neuronal effects for kids. And then this is the theory, this was published in February of this year. This is the theory that I talked about, the AMPK, that appears to be the pathway for causing the delay in the stress, the oxidative stress in those neurons and delay in development, and also in endothelial cells. So this study came out of China, and um, this came out in April of this year. And this came out of Western China where there are elevated levels of fluoride naturally in the water. Um, the levels of fluoride there range from 1.5 to 25 parts per million. So people are being exposed in those areas to rather high levels of fluoride. Again, not what we're recommending in the United States for our water systems, but when you get to those levels, fluoride appears to be a direct risk factor for hypertension. And again, it induced cardiovascular system injury, and it's really by oxidative stress on those endothelial cells. So it's a risk for hypertension. I mean, when you get above 1.5, there's another added systemic risk. So there's no denying that fluoride has some systemic effect and some systemic risk. Now, in this study, this came out as well. There were 585 adults in this from Western China. Again, uh, natural existing fluoride of the water from 1.5 to 25 parts per million. But exposure in this group, this cohort, exposure to drinking water that had fluoride in it increased the prevalence of carotid artery atherosclerosis. So here's yet another risk that you have with fluoride. So, you start adding these all up and, you can't ignore all this stuff. But again, I would counter the argument with we're talking about levels of fluoride that are significantly higher than we're recommending. Now, this is Alex, my friend Alex Vieira. Alex is probably the world's best knowledge on genetics and dental caries. He's the world's probably leading expert on that topic. He's also very knowledgeable about fluoridation and the effects of fluoride and remineralization. And, one of Alex's comments is, and this was in a paper he wrote a couple years ago, that it's, since all the studies are from 1975 and prior on fluoridated water, and the majority of them, and we've got all this other sources of fluoride that are readily available. It's reasonable to propose that maybe it's not necessary anymore. That we don't need to put fluoride in the community water system, and that's a point. And this was came out in the ADA Morning Huddle newspaper online, May 31st, which is what, 11 days ago, from the ADA. And the ADA's concern is that the underserved populations with little or no access to dental care may still be relying on community fluoridation to achieve overall well-being. And there's insufficient data to make that claim, but I think that's a valid concern. It's still a valid concern because we don't have data, right? So, we're guessing that it may or it may not have any impact. So when we talk about fluoride and we look at all these issues, it's complicated. Most of the community water fluoride studies were done prior to 1975. Since then, major changes in fluoride availability. I mentioned earlier, the American diet and pharmaceutical use has changed significantly since 1975. So one thought is we know that the primary benefit of fluoridated water is still topical. So you're getting these systemic risks by internally taking it when the primary benefit is topical to begin with. So is it possible to just get the topical benefit without this associated systemic risk? And I think that's a valid question. And there's more to that equation. So what is the exposure if you don't use fluoridated water and you're using a fluoridated oral health care product like a fluoride toothpaste? Well, interestingly enough, there's not much data on that. This has not been well studied. And I have dug for months trying to figure this out and actually came on these three studies yesterday. So I've been at this trying to figure this out because I would like to know if I'm making a recommendation. I want to know what the magnitude of the exposure is. If you're using a fluoridated toothpaste, we assume that it's, you're not swallowing it, so your exposure is pretty minimal, but we got a lot of patients on 5,000 part per million fluoride toothpaste, which is a pretty significant level of fluoride. So what is it? Well, this study was done, came out of Brazil and published quite a while ago, 2011, but they looked at 11, which is a very small test population, only 11 kids from age 2 to 4. I'm not sure. They tested their urine, not exactly sure how they collected urine samples on a 2-year-old, but they did. And the thing that they found in this study was that by using a fluoridated toothpaste, the fluoride levels went up dramatically, very quickly in the body, and then they crashed very quickly. And so one thing that we came away with from the study was we really didn't get an idea of magnitude of that because they were measuring in terms of milligrams of fluoride per day for a total dose, which is trying to, again, look for that health-based value. How much is the appropriate total dose of fluoride per day? And I'm looking at what's your exposure in terms of fluoridated product in parts per million. But what we learned out of the study was that fluoride is excreted by the kidneys fairly rapidly. So the half-life of fluoride in the body is about 20 hours. So that's not very long. Within a day, it's gone back down. In this study, same group in Brazil, now they looked at 11. I don't know why I don't know what their fascination is with the number 11, but 17 to 20-year-olds, and they put them on a low fluoride toothpaste, which was 550 parts per million, which is about half the dose that we have on our standard over-the-counter fluoride toothpaste in the United States, put them on a half dose and had them use it on a fasting or empty stomach to then look at the fluoride exposure. And then they put them on for a period of time for a month actually on a 1100 part per million fluoridated toothpaste that they brushed with after meals. Now we know that when you use a fluoride product in the mouth, like things affect it. Like if you've just eaten or you've just drank something, that affects your exposure level. And they found that the elevated fluoride level was only 10% higher than the low fluoride level on an empty or fasting stomach. Again, we didn't really get a feel for what the total impact was, but this systematic review, and they looked at, I don't know, 1,100 papers. They reduced it down to 28 studies, and then they pulled the data. And in the systematic review, that primarily toothpaste, they estimated contributes an average about 38% of your total daily fluoride intake, regardless of the concentration of the fluoride in the drinking water. And in the drinking water in these studies range from zero point 0.3 to 1.5 parts per million. So, I thought that it was interesting. Um, they came up with this data. 38% comes from an oral healthcare product, but again, we don't really have an idea of, well, how much is that, right? Um, I asked the question at the start, is fluoride good or evil? And there's always two sides to every issue. And when I look at two conflicting studies, if they're both good science, I always come away with the thought that um, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? And you're going to have people that are going to just cherry pick and they're going to pick just these studies that support their opinion and they're going to build a case around that. And for those of you who know me, I don't do that. Like, I want to look at all the scientific evidence, good and bad, positive, negative. I want to look at all of it because I want to make an honest decision. Um, but there's always two sides, and there's also facts and emotion. So I want you to stop and think for a second. What percent of your patients are averse to fluoride? Now, I retired from clinical practice 6 years ago, but I will tell you in Albany, Oregon, at that time, I I don't have hard data, hard numbers, but I would tell you that my gut feeling is it was around 30% of my patients were like, "Hey doc, no fluoride. I appreciate everything, but nope, I don't want a fluoride treatment. I don't want fluoride toothpaste. I don't want any fluoride." And so it's like, okay, I respect that. Um, that ties my hands a little bit in terms of their carries risk and what I'm going to be able to do for them. But obviously, I respect their opinion. I want to be there for them and help them. But I think we need to be real. And for a patient that says to me, "I don't want any fluoride," well, if you eat or drink virtually anything and it comes from the soil. Fluoride is in the soil on this planet, and it ends up in every plant. It ends up in every animal. If you look at drinks, for example, black tea has almost 4 parts per million fluoride. Now, that's my drink of choice. I drink probably 2 or 3 of those a day, unsweetened black iced tea. Wine, 1.53, grape juice, coffee. You got the patient that says, "No, doc, I don't want any fluoride," and they got a Starbucks in their hand. You just will be drinking fluoridated water because that's the level of fluoride you've got in your cup of coffee. Now, most people aren't aware of this, right? They don't realize, they think by avoiding fluoride in the water and fluoride toothpaste that they don't get any exposure to fluoride, and that's categorically not true. If you look at fluoride that's found in foods, raisins, those are healthy. It's 2.34 parts per million. Uh, Seafood like blue crab, shrimp. Now, okay, potato chips and fries aren't that healthy, but they have levels of fluoride again from the potatoes. Uh, Gravy, which I had one kid describe to me as his favorite beverage. Um, Gravy has 1 part per million. Oatmeal. I mean, you go down the list. It's like these are easily sourced on the internet. If you just type in and do a Google or a search, for the levels of fluoride. Now, looking on the opposite end of the spectrum, what drinks are low in fluoride? The only drink that doesn't have fluoride in it is filtered water. Now, milk and hard liquor are pretty low. I'm not going to advocate that, but if you really want to not have any fluoride, you need to have a a fluoride filter, filter all of your water, whether it's tap water or whether it's fluoridated water, community water, or even bottled water. Um, so, and when we look at foods, there's only three foods that I've found that don't have any fluoride, and that's some of the nuts, I don't know why, kiwi fruit, and sourdough bread. So if you don't want fluoride and you can live on filtered water, nuts, kiwi fruit, and sourdough bread, you're good to go, right? But everything else that you eat, literally, you're being exposed to fluoride, although at low levels, but you are being exposed to fluoride. So, I get emails every week about this, these questions. What about fluoride? What's real? What's the truth? Is this for real? What do I tell my patients? So I hope that I presented, tonight, right now, enough information and both sides of the science that you can have a very good expert conversation and counsel your patients, the ones that are in favor of fluoride and the ones that are opposed to fluoride, and just meet them where they're at and respect their opinion. I get asked about my opinion, and I got to tell you, my opinion has changed. And obviously, I manufacture fluoride, have been for 24 years. I use a fluoridated toothpaste every day, but I've got to the point where I respect people's both sides of this issue. And the thought of being forced to take a medication if you don't want it, I mean, I understand and I respect that. I look at the thought of, well, is there a way to get that topical benefit without the systemic exposure? Can we reduce that systemic exposure? And so, I look at it and I came to this conclusion. My opinion doesn't matter, and neither does yours. What matters most is your patient's opinion. And I think just having you have the knowledge and the ability to be the expert in the room and be able to counsel your patient is the most important thing. And I hope that I've given you the information tonight that you feel confident to be able to go out and do that. Um, Jenny, I'm not going to take any questions right at the moment. We're going to save these for the end because I want to get right into nano-HA because there's a tremendous amount of confusion about nano-hydroxyapatite. And so I want to just kind of go through that and hopefully dispel some of the misinformation that's out there and some of the marketing claims that aren't substantiated. So the properties of nano-hydroxyapatite has a critical pH of 5.5. Now, interestingly enough, and I find this quite curious, because the average crystallite size in your enamel is 20 nanometers. 20 nanometers also happens to be the most thermodynamically stable size of nano-HA. As demineralization occurs and the pH drops on hydroxyapatite, it gets smaller and it dissolves. And the lower the pH goes, the faster it dissolves until that particle, that crystallite, gets down to 20 nanometers. And then it reverses and it actually becomes more resistant to acid demineralization. And this is an unexplained phenomenon. Like, we don't understand because this does not follow the laws of thermodynamics, right? But it happens and it's real. And isn't it interesting, I think, that 6 billion years later, we're sitting here with teeth made out of the most thermodynamically stable form of nano-HA. I'll leave you with that, but I just find that fascinating. So as pH drops, it continues to dissolve until it gets to that size and then it reverses. And so that's a very critical part of nano-HA. So when you examine and talk about it, if you want to be biomimetic and use a product with nano-HA for your patients, you want to be in that 20 to 40 nanometer particle size. I have patients say, "Oh, I don't want any of that. That's a nano material. I don't want any nanomaterials." Well, I hate to break this to you, but your saliva, your body makes it. Your saliva is super saturated with nano-HA. That's how your body keeps your teeth mineralized. And so it's not that you're not going to be exposed to it. You make it. It's in your body. And as the saliva flow increases, the degree of supersaturation increases. So as you start to eat, the degree of supersaturation goes up. Already your body is trying to protect your teeth from that acidic episode when you eat. Fluoride absorbs to the surface of nano-HA, and it also attracts additional phosphate to it. It penetrates the lesion, and it also forms a new layer of apatite on the surface of enamel. So we'll talk about those. This is Edwina Kidd. This is from her textbook. It is clearly your saliva is super saturated with it. What do we know as nano-HA as a strategy for remineralization? It acts directly and as a reservoir for calcium and phosphate. The remineralization, when you look at the studies, and I'm not going to go through all of them here tonight, but there are a ton of them. When you look at them, all the studies conclude it's either as good as or superior to fluoride. Um, the concentration does not matter. I'll show you that study, whether it's 2%, 5%, or 10%. Size matters. It needs to be in that 20 to 40 nanometers, not 100 to 200 or above. So you need to know the size because that matters. The shape matters. The only body, regulatory body that studied this is in the European Union, and they banned, and I'll share that here in a minute, they banned all nano-HA that has needle-shaped particles in it. Needle-shaped particles are literally needle-shaped, and they are absorbed into the soft tissue and they can travel throughout the body. So if there's a concern, a systemic health concern about using nano-HA, it's about using particles that are needle-shaped. And Europe has banned all needle-shaped nano-HA. Now I heard on a podcast, oh, the European Union has never banned. In fact, they've approved nano-HA. Well, no, that's categorically not true. It was banned in 2018, and this ruling said it should not be used in cosmetic products. And then they came back in 2023, and they said, well, we have looked at this application from this company, and they've gone through this battery of research. And we've concluded that it's okay to use it, but within these limitations, 95.8% of the particles have to have an aspect ratio of less than 3. That means they're less than 3 times longer than they are wide, and the remaining cannot exceed 4.9 to 1. So they're looking for rod shape, not needle shape. And the only one that's been studied and released at this point in time is Fluid Nova from Portugal, and their product is Nano-XIM. And so this is the only one that has been scrutinized and studied. So I'd be looking for that if I was using a product with nano-HA in it, I'd be looking for that. Now, I will tell you this, there's a company in Germany that's just gone through that same approval process and has conditional approval, and that company is Budenheim. And they've actually expanded or loosened the regulations a little bit on this, but I've looked at all the research that they did, and it's impressive when you look at it. So I feel strongly that these materials are safe to recommend for your patients. When we look at the research, if it's biomimetic and the right size, it starts to form new enamel and repair demineralized enamel in as fast as 10 minutes. But you got to stop and think, this is just what your mouth does. This is how your body does. This is how it works. And this was a study that I did with John Kois and published back in 2013, and we found deposition of nano-hydroxyapatite immediately on a demineralized bovine tooth surface enamel. In this study, the nano-HA showed the highest remineralization potential, and in this study, it was found superior to conventional fluoride. So I think that's again, these are just samples of the studies. There's so many of these that have been done. And in this study, they compared it to Novamin, and actually it produced significantly better results than fluoride or Novamin containing dentifrices. In this study, they concluded that hydroxyapatite toothpaste was superior to more effective than fluoride in controlling dentin hypersensitivity, and it actually created a new apatite layer into the tubule and those exposed dental tubules and on the surface. Now I have to tell you, it's very effective at doing that, but this is not a one-time treatment and your patient has no dentin sensitivity. This takes months for this to occur. It occurs, but it takes months of consistent exposure like in a oral health care product, but it does happen. The FDA actually allows manufacturers to make a whitening claim if they have nano-HA in their product. It effectively whitens teeth by creating a new layer of hydroxyapatite on the surface of the enamel. Again, this is not a white strip. This is not a bleaching gel. You're not going to get a 7 day, two shade response. This is something that's going to take months and years, but it does have an impact. I mean, it does work, and it does lighten teeth. Now, I said the concentration is not that important. Um, this was the only study I can find comparing different concentrations, but this was in a mouth rinse. And at 2%, 5%, and 10% nano HA, they all um, increased the remineralization significantly and the microhardness of all the samples, and occurred also in obviously the sodium fluoride. But the increase between these different percentages was not statistically significant. So basically, 2%, 5%, 10% are going to have pretty much the same outcome. I know that was let me just clarify, that was in a rinse, but that's the only data I have that I can share with you that I've found. And in this study, notably, the most important role of nano HA is particle size, and 20 nanometers, 20 to 40 in that range is where you want to be in terms of particle size for your nano HA. And Nano XIM is smaller than 100, and their medical grade is narrows down, takes 3 more days for them to refine, and it narrows down into that right around 30 nanometers. So it's the medical grade Nano XIM is the most biomimetic, and therefore probably has the best achievement of remineralization results. Now, the other thing that happens is you're going to see products on the market that have fluoride and nano HA in them. You can't just mix those two products together because the nano HA, because those calcium that are in the hydroxyapatite chrysolite still attract the fluoride. They pull it out of the toothpaste and it adheres to the surface, which makes it not available to be tested um, as free available fluoride ions. And per the FDA monograph, there's a required level for that, and so this is a very tricky thing to balance, and so that's a concern in using those. So, I get a lot of questions about nano HA, and the questions shouldn't be, well, what percentage, what I hear typically, what percentage nano HA you have, as if this is some dose dependent thing. The question should be, what is the source and the size of the nano HA? Because that's the most important part. Then I want to know, what's your remineralization result? Show me your surface microhardness test. Show me your data. How did it? Well, I want to know the outcome. I don't care what other claims you're making. Show me your test data, right? There are standardized tests for determining this. And so let me see your test data, and let's make a decision based on outcome. And then if you have fluoride in a nano HA product, what is the actual level of available fluoride ions? Like, do you know? Have you tested it? That's a very important question to ask. So those are the questions if you're looking at nano HA products as an alternative fluoride, one that doesn't have fluoride in it. Those are the questions that you should be asking to get the best out of your product. Wow, I actually got through all of this material faster than I anticipated that I would tonight. I hope that it was informative. I hope I didn't create more questions than I answered. But I think Lisa and Jenny, at this point in time, we got time for probably a handful of questions. So I'm pretty excited to hear what questions people have tonight.
You did great, Dr. Cooch. And we did get a handful of questions. One that just came in, maybe you could clarify for Denton sensitivity, is it nano HA or just hydroxyapatite?
Now, that was nano HA
Okay.
in that study. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. And then this question just came in and it says, with hydroxyapatite products, have they studied what the needle shaped does systemically? So how do we know we won't be having this same kind of conversation 10 years from now regarding the shape?
Again, now that is a great question, and that's a question you should be asking because the Nano XIM doesn't have any needle-shaped particles in it, and neither does the Budenheim, the product that's going to be approved fairly soon. So those two products, I can tell you, if you have an oral healthcare product that you recommend for your patients, and it's sourced from Nano XIM or Nano XIM, better yet, medical grade, which is even more correct size for to be biomimetic, there are no needle-shaped particles in there. So uh, we're not going to be having that conversation 10 years down the road. Those are the only two that have been studied, evaluated by any regulatory body, and deemed to be safe. Now, there's a lot of nano HA products out there, but these are the only two that have been studied and demonstrated to be safe. So that I would just, leave you with that information. Um,
The
the
second
FDA,
part,
the F,
oh, go ahead.
The FDA has not yet regulated nano-hydroxyapatite. I believe they probably will at some point in time, um, and or they will follow the kind of the guidelines that we got out of the European Union. So um, that's the best answer I can give you. Those are the only two and the Budenheim materials aren't on the market just yet. So the only one that's out there is Nano-XIM and Nano-XIM medical grade. So I would be looking for that in a product.
And so the second part of that question is that are there any products from Fluidanova with Noxum that you recommend?
Actually, so Carry Free became the first customer of Fluid Nova, and we were the first company in the United States to introduce nano hydroxyapatite into the oral healthcare products, and that was back in 2012. And we exclusively have used the medical grade. And we have very good data on remineralization with it. And so I would recommend that. If short of that, I would look for any product then that had Nano XIM on the label. Like if you were going to recommend a product, I'd be looking for that. Because then at least you know there are no needle-shaped particles, you know where the source is, it's been studied, it's been demonstrated to be safe at a cellular level, a soft tissue cellular level. They do all of those studies. So those are products I would recommend.
And then in your research, did you come across any research on geriatric studies on the benefits of systemic versus topical fluoride in the geriatric
Um,
population?
no. And but my answer to that would be uh, the geriatric population, I don't think you're going to get any real systemic benefit out of fluoride. The real systemic benefit we believed, and this is an older paradigm, was that it would be incorporated into the developing enamel, and so that children would have more fluorapatite in their teeth as the teeth were forming, and they would be more resistant to decay. Some of that happens. And it's why you see fluorosis in the teeth, right? When you get too high a level, I mean, it does get incorporated into the enamel. But once the enamel's formed, any benefit is strictly topical. So, and the majority of the benefit, we believe, even in children, is the topical benefit of, it's like a 0.7% fluoride rinse that that you're swallowing. So for the geriatric population, I can't logically think of a systemic benefit from the fluoride, and you've got maybe those associated systemic risks. Although I am about to conduct a study where I'm actually going to measure urine levels on 20 subjects using a non-fluoridated toothpaste and then using a fluoridated toothpaste and seeing what the actual exposure level is in parts per million. And with a study population of only 20 people, that's again not a big test group, but it'll give us just a point on the board to say uh, it's big magnitude. This is something we really should be concerned about, or it's pretty minimal. And my gut feeling is it's pretty minimal. I've been test. This is going to sound strange. I've been testing my own urine, and I have obviously scientific laboratory. I have one that I actually have is that's not in my quality control lab, but I have a fluoride specific probe. And so I'm looking at, because I drink 3 or 4 glasses of iced tea every day that are almost 4 parts per million fluoride. So I get quite a bit of systemic exposure there. And I use a 5,000 part per million fluoride toothpaste every day. And I really assumed that my fluoride levels would be fairly high. And they were, in my urine, were only 0.02 parts per million. So my gut feeling, just on a case study of one, my gut feeling is that probably our systemic exposure to oral health care products with fluoride in them is pretty minimal and probably not of a big consequence. But I don't know that for a fact, and I'll have data. I'll be presenting that at a meeting in about a month. So working on that. The biggest concern is for children under the age of 8. We've had this concern that they're going to swallow it, right? So, the fluoride is like, you're using fluoride toothpaste. Well, it's no big deal because you're not swallowing it. Well, you take a 5-year-old, they're swallowing part of it. And maybe I just found out I have one grandson that was swallowing it, who was 8 years old and swallowing a mouth rinse. Um, and so you learn these things. And so that kind of fluoride exposure is a concern, I think. So as long as they're not swallowing it, I think your geriatric population, given them, I think the best benefit in there is going to be fluoride varnish, silver diamine, like particularly people that are in nursing care, in care facilities where they're not really getting great oral health care on a daily basis, and the diet may not be terrific, ideal, let's say, and their home care isn't going to be ideal. I think the greatest benefit from fluoride for those patients is going to be fluoride varnish 4 times a year and silver diamine fluoride and also the new nano silver fluoride. So I think, that's probably the best topical benefit you can get to those patients and a 5,000 part per million dentifrice if they're at risk for getting decay. But in terms of any systemic benefit from fluoridated water, probably almost nothing. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I hope that makes sense. These are great questions, by the way.
That you actually ended up answering a couple of other questions that came in regarding SDF and varnish, because there were a few questions people wanted to know your take on varnish.
Uh,
Uh,
again, the evidence there is well established, uh, particularly in children. But again, we extrapolate that to geriatrics and adults. But fluoride varnish 4 times a year, that's a great benefit. I mean, that's the best benefit I think you can get strictly from fluoride in that population. Um, More frequent than 4 times a year doesn't show an additional benefit. So kind of the cutoff is every 3 months. Silver diamine fluoride works great on enamel lesions. I caution people using it that we thought when it first came out that it was like the silver bullet, proverbially silver bullet, and I was restoring full mouths and segmenting care, and I would get to my last quadrant to prepare with the drill, putting, doing crown and bridge. Um, and I had several patients where I had treated with silver diamine fluoride, the dentin. They were large lesions. They were quote unquote arrested, which I don't use that term. I think that's a misnomer. I think we should not be using that term with any of these products. You've delayed it, but I question whether it's been arrested because those dentin lesions progressed to the point when I started to prepare them that I ended up extracting teeth. So that was kind of an eye opener for me. They were black and hard. And when I cut through that surface, it was soft and mushy, and it went all the way into the pulp and all the way through the tooth. I didn't have a clinical crown left. So I caution people that it's not magic, it's not a silver bullet. And if you go back and then reread the research, all the research is on enamel lesions, and it's very effective on enamel lesions, but we're using it on dentin lesions or root surface lesions. And so we appear to have this arrested black hard surface, and the nano silver fluoride doesn't turn that surface black. That's the kind of the difference, the benefit of that versus silver diamine fluoride. But it gets hardened and it appears to be arrested, but actually that lesion is progressing underneath that surface. So my advice is just to be aware of that and just kind of be careful with that material. I used it in practice. It's a great material. I recommend it. I think you should have it in your armamentarium, but just be aware of the fact that it's not bulletproof. So my thoughts on that.
Excellent. And then we are at time.
Thank you, everybody. And I really appreciate you spending this hour. Like I say, I hope I answered more questions than I created. So, again, thank you so much for spending your time with me this evening.